everyone. Welcome to the Palestine Center. Oh, I think I hit something. Sorry about that. Thank you for coming to today's lecture on Palestinian refugees in Syria. I want to remind you that it's actually the first installment of our three-part lecture series, which is going to focus on the larger theme of exile in the Palestinian consciousness, and that'll be continuing in the next 2 weeks. I also would like to greet our online viewers who are watching on our live stream and remind you that you can tweet in any questions that you have to Palestine Center, and we will actually be answering some of those questions during the Q&A following the lecture. Today we are going to hear from writer and researcher Helena Cobbin, as well as Dr. Faida Tota, who is a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. And in this panel, they will explore the impact of the war on Syria on Palestinian refugees who have had a presence in the country since 1948. They will discuss the significance of the multiple displacements that these refugees have faced throughout their lifetimes. For Palestinians in Syria, the war presents a peril of Palestinian statelessness not often discussed. Without a state of their own, are Palestinians always to be plagued by the political unrest of host nations? Please join me in welcoming our speakers. And we will hear from Helena Cobbin first.
Thanks to Leila and Graham and everybody here at the Palestine Center for setting this up. It looks like a really exciting series, and it feels completely right to me to start the discussion with the situation of Palestinians in Syria. I'm just trying to figure out where to put all my stuff, but I will figure it out. Oh, that's not even flat. Right, okay. So the first question is, who are the Palestinians in Syria? This map, not this one actually, but this one, rather a poorly presented map, but it shows you the blue spots are the official Palestinian refugee camps in Syria, and the gray spots are what are called concentrations or gatherings of Palestinians in Syria. So there are about, I think, 9 refugee camps in Syria. You'll see they are clustered around Damascus. There's one important one down in the south in Daraa, which has been a center for the conflict, and then a couple up around near Aleppo, also heavily contested area. And then, if I can figure this out, yep. This is the actual number of refugee camps and concentration slash gatherings around Damascus. The most important and biggest of these camps is Yarmouk Camp, and we'll come back to Yarmouk later. So in Syria, as elsewhere where the United Nations Relief and Works Agency operates, and by the way, all this data comes from them because they have excellent data on the situation of Palestinian refugees in Syria. In Syria, there's, as you can see, 529,000 Palestinian refugees. Now, I think what UNRWA is counting here are registered refugees, which is much less than the number of refugees as a whole. When all UNRWA can deal with is registered refugees, and to be a registered refugee, you had to be either you or your forebears on a certain date in 1950 present as a refugee in one of the areas where UNRWA was delivering services, which did not include Egypt and Iraq, for example. So nobody who was there on that date got to be a registered refugee, and you had to demonstrate need. So there were a lot of sort of, at that point, 1950, exiles from Palestine, actual refugees from Palestine who were not able to demonstrate neediness and therefore did not get onto the UNRWA rolls and were not counted as registered refugees, but that doesn't prevent them being refugees, of course. So the numbers of actual refugees are always much higher than the numbers of registered refugees. So I've been coming and going to Syria since about actually the first time I went there was 1970, but I was still quite young then. But I've been coming and going to Syria for professional reasons as a journalist and researcher, and mainly for that, since 1975. I used to go there quite a lot during the Lebanese Civil War when I was covering the Lebanese Civil War from Beirut. And at that time, of course, Syria seemed like a haven from the conflict in Lebanon, although, of course, there was always a lot of repression and manipulation of the Palestinians living in Syria. I want to note, just parenthetically, that historically, amongst the refugee population in Syria of Palestinian refugees, there have always been a significant proportion of Christians, that Syria has been a country that's been, very open to Christians from Palestine, and from it's obviously it has a huge native Syrian Christian population, and they were very hospitable to the Christians under stress in Iraq after the American invasion of Iraq. And so, the travails of the Palestinian refugees who are Christians in Syria is linked with that whole crisis of Near Eastern indigenous Christianity and those communities under stress in Iraq, in Palestine, to some extent in Egypt, and definitely now in Syria, where anybody who is not a Sunni Muslim is, and many people who are considered fair game by the extremists among the Syrian oppositionists. So the Palestinian refugees in Syria over these decades, let's say from 1950 until 2 years ago, had a situation that was fairly good compared with that of other Palestinian refugees, for example, in Lebanon. First of all, they didn't have the civil war, and secondly, they were allowed to work. They had full economic and social rights. They could go to the university. They could teach in the university. They were very integrated into Palestinian society, but that was as the result of a sort of a Faustian bargain. They were not allowed to agitate against the regime in power. That was the bargain. And come to that, neither were any Syrian citizens. So, I mean, it was like multi-dimensional equal opportunity repression. But when I was working with a group of a Quaker working party back almost exactly 10 years ago, and we were looking at the situation of Palestinian refugees, I was with a small group that went to Syria and talked to some refugees there. And I was just rereading this. I mean, it's such a sweet picture of these people and their situation back in 2002. There's a little vignette we put in the book about Professor Khairiyya Qasmiyeh, who had a long morning of administering exams in the Damascus University College of Letters, where she is the chair of the history department. She was born to a middle-class family in Haifa in the early 1940s. Oh, I remember Haifa, she told us fondly, blah, blah, blah. And just this, like, a really sweet narrative of a woman who had a very stable and productive life in Syria. And, then we got into this discussion with one of her colleagues who was a Palestinian philosophy professor at Damascus University, Ahmed Belqawi. And I mean, this was the kind of obviously the upper end of the social echelon of Palestinians in Syria, and there were many who were, hard-scrabble farmers or construction workers, but they were, fully integrated into the economy and society, just lacking citizenship. Now, of course, just lacking citizenship is a huge thing that Professor Totah and I will be discussing a lot more about. Well, I remember from my time in Lebanon that civil wars, number one, they're always highly inimical to the interests of women and children and the vulnerable in society. So anybody who claims that you can fight a war for humanitarian purposes is either ignorant or lying or both. But there's also a particular vulnerability of people who don't have a state to protect them. Foreigners in Lebanon, there were all kinds of foreigners in Lebanon when I was there. Egyptians, Iraqis, Iranians, Syrians, Americans, French, you know, when your neighborhood is caught up in turmoil, if you have a consulate and an embassy that can get you out of there, you know, remember the Filipinos in Kuwait during the Iraqi invasion, or, you know, any group of migrant workers or foreigners that have a government to protect them. It's not great. Your life is majorly disrupted. You have to be repatriated, so on and so forth. But you have somebody looking out for you. Palestinians don't. And I remember, I mean, in Lebanon during the Civil War, the Palestinians had the PLO, which was acting like a quasi-state. And actually, that was part of the problem for Palestinians in Lebanon, because the PLO was a party to the Civil War. But now they don't even have a functioning PLO that is capable of intervening to just, you know, advocate for their physical survival in Syria. It has left them incredibly vulnerable. Oh, I have these PowerPoint things. Let me run through them. So, okay. This is all thanks to UNRWA. So we're talking about the UNRWA counted 529,000 Palestine refugees, more than 50% displaced. And if you look at the pictures that UNRWA and others have, you see Palestinians, displaced Palestinians, living in their schools, living in tents. It looks just like 1948 all over again, just like 2008 all over again. I mean, this kind of cycle of stuff that happens to Palestinians over and over the decades. So the number now in need of assistance increased to 420,000 out of 520,000. And so need of assistance means really in need of assistance. If you look at the kind of assistance they're giving, in many cases to people whose homes have been destroyed, they list these things called hygiene kits. Now, maybe some of you are familiar with what is a hygiene kit. A hygiene kit is like a bucket that can be used to transport water, some soap powder, a couple of towels, toothpaste, toothbrush. It's for a family that's lost everything and is living, you know, in the wild. And that's where many of these internally displaced and externally displaced Palestinians are today, along with the Syrians who have been displaced, obviously in larger numbers, because there were larger numbers of them to start with. I think the proportion of Palestinians in Syria who have been displaced is larger than the proportion of Syrians. And they get treated differently. They get treated differently in the following way. Every Palestinian in the world is counted as a Palestinian in some kind of UN scheme of things, and becomes the responsibility, when in need, of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, which has existed since 1950, UNRWA. Everybody else in the world, when they become displaced over national borders, becomes the responsibility of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which has a different, much stronger mandate to provide services and protection to refugees. Palestinians inside Syria do have a degree of services that is provided to them by UNRWA, but they have no protection. UNRWA has no protection mandate. And then once everything has completely fallen apart in Yarmouk refugee camp, or whichever of the many destroyed refugee camps there are in Syria, and they go to Lebanon, or they try to go to Jordan, or God forbid they might try to go home to Palestine. How about that? How about creating a state that could be a haven for distressed populations? You would imagine that many Jewish people could perhaps sympathize with this aspiration. But no. Back in December, there was a huge battle in Yarmouk. camp that just about destroyed Yarmouk camp. Don't know if I've got any numbers here. No, I don't have the numbers here. This number is horrible. 57 of UNRWA's 118 schools had sustained various levels of conflict-related damage. 7 UNRWA area staff members have been killed and 12 are missing, some presumed detained. We don't read about this nearly enough in our newspapers here, about the plight of these very vulnerable Palestinians in Syria. So Yarmouk Camp, huge battles. They made it into a lot of the... by the way, all the people who are avidly taking notes, you can get online and find all this stuff in the UNRWA report that was published in June. Very good PDF that they have. Or you can take notes, that's fine. So the Yarmouk battles did make it into some of the media in this country. And afterwards, Abu Mazen pleaded with Netanyahu to let some of the very distressed families from Syria, Palestinian families from Syria, come to the West Bank. And Netanyahu answered and said, yes, maybe some small number of them can come, but the condition is that they give up their right of return to their original homes and properties. And Abu Mazen said no deal. Now, we can discuss that. It's a tough call, actually. But that meant that nobody was able to get back. By contrast, this is an interesting little side note to this. Hamas was able to get, or let's say people were able to get 300 families, Palestinian refugees from Syria, resettled in Gaza in the days when the Rafah crossing was a little bit more open than what it is now. And these are 300 families that are being counted by UNRWA, and they're being given emergency services in Gaza. So you could say this is a small instance in which Hamas is somewhat more effective than Abu Mazen in protecting the rights of distressed Palestinians. Most recently, Abu Mazen has been, he was in Lebanon a couple of days ago, which is interesting. The regional dynamics are shifting very, very speedily. And he made a point of saying the Palestinians are not a party to the conflict, either in Lebanon or in Syria, which is very, very important. It's a very important statement that he made. And I wish that he and Hamas had been, equally kind of clear and forthright about that all along. You have to realize that, of course, as of January, February, March of 2011, you still had the Hamas leadership was in Damascus, operating under that Faustian bargain that I described earlier. I went and interviewed Khalid Michels there a couple of 2 or 3 times, 2008, 2009, 2010 also, I think. And, they were running their entire Hamas leadership from there, although it's kind of a fairly decentralized leadership. And then the conflict in Syria started escalating, and essentially Khalid Michels and the leadership of Hamas were placed in, I guess, what they thought was an untenable situation. The regime was demanding that, as usual, they don't do anything to combat the regime. Meantime, their ideological allies in the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood were demanding that they do. Now, these kind of dilemmas are not new for Palestinians. I mean, they're exactly the same kind of dilemmas that Palestinians have faced in Syrian-occupied Lebanon, for example, in the 1980s and 1990s. Long story short, in response to that kind of pressure, the Hamas leadership went to Doha, and have no doubt been living in, a 5-star hotel there or something. And that meant cutting their political relationship with the Assad regime in Syria, which had huge consequences and led, you could say, to the conflict within the Yarmouk camp, because there were obviously a lot of opposition people, including armed opposition people, who were in the camp and who were not being sort of calmed down or clamped down on by Hamas anymore. And so you got the horrible situation escalating inside Yarmouk camp and other refugee camps. And of course that has a big effect on the kind of the broader political situation in the region. There was a very good report that the International Crisis Group published just a few days ago, actually at the end of June. And they have a quote in there that I wish I had, so I have to give attribution to somebody else for it. But they said that what's happened in Syria is that, to the conflict in Syria, is that it has become transformed in recent months from a Syrian conflict with regional consequences into a regional conflict with a Syrian focus. In other words, the geopolitics of it now are being driven much more by outsiders. But of course, who is it that gets caught in the meat grinder? It's everybody resident in Syria, whether they are Syrian nationals, Iraqi refugees, or Palestinian refugees. And the prospects for de-escalation are extremely slim, probably none. So, well, I guess it's time for me to end. Otherwise, I could carry on, but we'll have the Q&A session. I just want to note that I am very pleased to be here with my colleague David Grant, and some of the books published by my new publishing company, including The Gaza Kitchen, which I hope all of you have bought, and if you haven't, you can buy a copy afterwards. It's the most intelligently political cookbook you will ever read. So, I'm looking forward to hearing from Dr. Tota and then engaging with you all in the Q&A.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I'd like to start with the fact that what's happening in Syria is just impossible to comprehend. The civil war, the destruction of an entire country, the demolition of neighborhoods, of houses, of infrastructure, the killing of hundreds of thousands of people, the displacements of almost more than 3 million people, and many of them crossing the borders into neighboring countries, is just terrible. And you kind of want to look into the future and see what could possibly happen. And even if the fighting ends anytime soon, and there is some kind of reconciliation among the fighting parties, warring parties, what is going to rebuild all of the destroyed homes, schools, hospitals? I just saw a report from UNRWA that says that the Human Development Index in Syria has fallen to its level 35 years ago. So we are 35 years ago right now as a result of this civil war. And amidst all of this destruction, I am very happy that the Jerusalem Fund organized this session and allowed us to talk about the plight of a group of people that tend to be forgotten. And this is not to say that there are not other minorities in Syria that are suffering, but the conflict in Syria, the crisis in Syria, brings to the forefront once again the vulnerability of Palestinians and Palestinian refugees in the region whenever a crisis hits. And today, I would like to emphasize 3 points. I really want to talk about Palestinians in Syria and Ms. Colvin mentioned Khayriya Qasmiya and Ahmed Barqawi. I got to know Khayriya Qasmiya, a fascinating woman. I also got to know people at the, not upper echelon of Palestinian refugees in Syria, but actually Palestinians who were living in the old city. And I want to talk about them and how they were relating to life in Syria. Many of them were lower middle class, some of them were working class, but their plight is very much reminiscent of Palestinians everywhere living in refugee camps around the region, even though the old city where they were living was not a refugee camp. And finally, I would like to conclude with, what does it mean to be Palestinian in the current turmoil in the Middle East? And what does the political transformation of the Middle East mean for Palestinians? Now, one of the fascinating things about being a Palestinian is that the identity of Palestinians is very much linked to this whole notion of refugee-ness, right? Even when you're not a refugee, the experience of refugee-ness hits home in so many different ways. And then until recently, when you talk about refugees in the Middle East, you'd think Palestinians. The recent conflicts have led to new waves of refugees. You've had the civil war in Lebanon, which created different waves of refugees, the most recent being 2006 when Israel invaded Lebanon. Ironically, many of those Lebanese found a safe haven in Syria. And then you have Iraqi refugees from the two Gulf Wars that took place in Iraq. And in Syria, you had Sudanese refugees. Syria offered haven for a number of Sudanese refugees as well. But these refugees are different than Palestinians because, as Ms. Cobain emphasized, Palestinians are stateless. They do not have a nation state that looks out for their interests, but also they do not have a nation state to which they can return if a solution is found for their crisis. And this becomes a very important point when you're dealing with Palestinians, and it comes to the forefront when you're at the border. One aspect of refugee-ness is detainment at the border. And I believe next week the Jerusalem Fund is hosting Sandra Tamari and Noor Judah, who were two women, American passport, traveling to Israel, and they were sent back. As a Palestinian traveling the Middle East, although I'm American, nothing on my passport indexes me as Palestinian. I panic every time I come to a border. I am always singled out as Palestinian. So you can only imagine what it's like to be a Palestinian traveling under travel documents that say you are a Palestinian and say that you are a refugee. We see it again and again. Palestinian refugees from Syria trying to go into Jordan have been detained, and many of them were sent back. And the Jordanians, you know, they understand the problem of Palestinians, and they sent back Palestinians that did not have Syrian papers. A replay of what happens to Palestinians because of their statelessness. In 2003, after the fall of Saddam, a number of refugees from Iraq tried to cross into Syria. The Palestinians were detained on the border. They were kept on the border in no man's land for several years while humanitarian agencies were looking for third-party countries to take them in. We see it again in Libya after the fall of Gaddafi. Libyans were able to cross into Egypt. Palestinians, again, were detained at the border. And this detainment is a result of their statelessness. Ironically, whereas being a Palestinian, and a Palestinian refugee in particular, is grounds for discrimination, especially when it comes to crossing borders throughout the Middle East, sometimes not even the Middle East. I've had some skirmishes in European airports, is the cause. Arab countries love the cause. They love the Palestinian cause. From Nasser on to even Ahmadinejad, they promote and they support and uphold the cause. But when it comes to people, it is an entirely different story. Now, to turn to Syria, from the very beginning, even before 1948, the Palestinian cause resonated with the Syrian public and with Syrian nationalists. 1948 happened 2 years after Syria gained its independence from France. Part of the establishment of a Syrian national identity was linked to supporting the Palestinian cause. The first Syrian president, Quwatli, was a supporter of Jaish al-Inqadh, which the Salvation Army that recruited young Syrian men to go and fight against the Zionists in Palestine. You had also Izzuddin al-Qassam, Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam, who was a leader of the many platoons that were fighting in Palestine against the Zionists. He was Syrian. And on through Syrian politics, presidents adopted the Palestinian cause for their own political maneuvering to drum up support domestically among the Syrian masses, but also to drum up support internationally. Hosni Zaim, for example, was trying to curry favor with the Americans in the 1950s by putting forth a peaceful resolution to the Palestinian refugees in Syria. He was only in office for a short period of time, and nothing came out of that. And even Hafiz al-Assad was a big supporter of the Palestinian cause, and his support for the Palestinian cause was very much colored by his relationship with Yasser Arafat. The two of them did not get along at all. Whereas Hafiz al-Assad did not trust Arafat. Of course, the trust goes both ways. He also thought he was too flamboyant and fickle. And of course, his suspicions came to fruition when Arafat signed Oslo, and the Syrians were livid that Arafat went ahead and signed a unilateral agreement with the Israelis. So what happened with the the Palestinians in Syria? As Ms. Koban mentioned, they have permanent residencyship, which falls just short of being full citizens. They don't have the right to own investment property. They cannot vote in elections, but as a Palestinian in Syria told me, what elections are you going to vote in? It's always Assad. And they have to serve in the army, but not in the Syrian army. They serve in the Palestinian army. So they are somewhat equal, but separate. And of course, on their Syrian travel documents, it does indicate that they are Palestinian. Now, Assad, both father and son, were very good at manipulating the Palestinian cause. The most recent manipulation of the cause happened in June 2011, almost 2 years ago, when in demonstrations against the Six-Day War with Israel, it was the first time that there was a breach of the border between Syria and Israel. And Israeli soldiers shot and killed 25 protesters who breached the northern border with Syria. This was the first time since October 1973, when after the signing of the armistice between Syria and Israel, that there has been a breach on the border. The Israelis were quick to point out that this was Syria's way, Assad's way, Bashar al-Assad, the son's way, of trying to distract from the destruction that his forces, his bombers, his tanks were creating in Hama, and the killing of civilians in the city and in surrounding villages. But it was also Assad's way of reminding Israel, as well as the international community, of the role that Syria has played in the Arab-Israeli conflict, that it was able to rein in the Palestinians in Syria, unlike the Palestinians in Lebanon, and keep them from conducting any operations across the border. But the situation also brings forth two important things. It emphasizes the precarious situation of Palestinians in Syria, where they can be used as political pawns, and it also shows the importance of the cause rather than the people to the Syrian regime, even during a civil war. So, what about the Palestinians in Syria? And as we've seen the statistics, there are over 500,000 registered Palestinian refugees living in camps, Yarmouk being the largest, though Much of it has been destroyed in the most recent fighting between the rebel forces and the government forces. And to really bring home what it means to be Palestinian in Syria, I want to focus on a community of Palestinians that I've gotten to know who live in the old city of Damascus. And I focused on these refugees because they were not living in a camp. A camp is usually indexed as a refugee space. However, these Palestinians were living in the old cities in homes that were confiscated from Jews that fled Damascus in 1948. So these houses were under the trusteeship of the government, and they rented them out to Palestinians who lost their homes to Jewish immigrants in Palestine. So there's some kind of justice there. However, many of those Palestinians that I've gotten to know would insist that they remain Palestinians. They are Palestinians. So it's not just that Syria has policy in place that creates distinction between Palestinians and Syrians by kind of granting them almost full citizenship, but not quite, using their cause for political gains in its fight with Israel and even in Lebanon, but also the Palestinians themselves that live in Syria want to remain separate and distinct from the Syrians. They maintain subtle differences. They still speak with a Palestinian dialect. They haven't adapted the Shami or the Damascene dialect. And it was very funny when a group of women that I've gotten to know, I went to visit them one day, and they asked me, what kind of tea do you want? Do you want Shami tea, Damascene tea, or Palestinian tea? And I'm like, and Shami tea, you make it with mint, and Palestinian tea with sage or miramiye. And so even by the tea, they want to create this difference between them and the Syrians. What also happened to many of those Syrians that lived in the old city of Damascus is that their young men were recruited to fight in the war camps in Lebanon. Syria, which is one of the main forces, Palestinian forces, founded by Hafiz al-Assad to fight in the Lebanese civil war. And so many of them had to express their allegiance to the regime and to Assad in particular. So you also had this complicated relationship, whereas as a refugee, you are a humanitarian case, there is some charity granted to you. But when you become a guerrilla fighter, that complicates your presence within the country. So a lot of those young men actually died fighting in Lebanon. And it was interesting to see what happened after Oslo. The signing of Oslo was a deadly blow to many Palestinians living in Syria. Not only did they felt abandoned by Arafat, the fact that the right of return has not been negotiated since ever, has never been negotiated ever. And the Syrians, especially the Syrian government, was always quick to point out that Palestinians cannot even trust their leadership. Arafat abandoned the Palestinian, but Assad supports the Palestinian. What happened to many of those young men who lived in the old city was they abandoned the political struggle, the political nidal. Many of them became more religious, finding more solace in the Islamic Ummah rather than pan-Arabism. Many of them immigrated. There was a large number of families that left for Sweden. Sweden was one of the few countries after Oslo that was accepting Palestinian refugees. So, Palestinians in Syria, yes, they had it better in Lebanon, but they were still distinct and separate from Syrians. They were constantly being used as pawns for political maneuvering within the country as well within regional and international politics. But they themselves were not passive. They did try to maintain a strong Palestinian identity. The current crisis once again highlights their vulnerability as stateless people, as refugees, and the fact that their cause remains more important than what happens to the actual people. And I just want to really emphasize how the Palestinian cause continues to be manipulated and used by Arab leaders. Morsi is the latest example in Egypt, and you kind of can tell the relationship between the Egyptian government and the Palestinians by the status of the tunnels. Are the tunnels to Gaza open, or are they closed? Mubarak kept a tight control over the tunnels in coordination with the Israelis. When he fell from power, the tunnels were free. There was more movement in and out of the tunnels. Morsi kind of put it back under control. But I think what was most telling was when Israel attacked Gaza last year. And I do believe it was a test of Morsi and what was Morsi going to do. The fact that he did not do anything and that got him the praise of Hillary Clinton shows once again that the Palestinian cause can be used not only for political gain domestically, but also to shore up political cachet with the United States as well. So, what's going to happen to the Palestinians? The plight of the Palestinians is no different than the other Syrians that are caught in this conflict. It's only a little bit more complicated when it comes to leaving, when it comes to trying to find countries that would take them in. They still lack the protection of their own government, and Ms. Koban talked about Abbas trying to negotiate an agreement with the Israelis, but they do have UNRWA. And in no way, shape, or form am I trying to glorify UNRWA. It remains a political organization. It is restricted by what it can and cannot do, not only by its mandate, but also due to donors and to the countries in which it operates. Yet, in times of crisis like these, we do see that UNRWA is stepping out. It is offering more humanitarian assistance to the displaced Palestinian families in Syria. Cash, emergency cash, food, as well as medicine. And it is spreading the plight of Palestinians and asking for more donations. Ironically, UNRWA only does this because Palestinians are refugees and are stateless. So we see it reinforcing the statelessness and refuginess of Palestinian. And it's moments of crisis in the Middle East that highlights the precarious situation of being a Palestinian refugee. Thank you.
So we're going to open up the floor to questions. Does anyone have anything to start with? Go ahead right over here.
Thanks very much. Bill Corcoran from Anira. I pose a question to both of you if I could. Our office in Lebanon just conducted a study of the newly arrived Palestinians in Lebanon from Syria. And one of the things that came out of this was that 50% of them know for a fact that their houses were destroyed back in Syria, most probably Yarmouk. What's your prediction about once hostilities cease in Syria, are these people inclined to try to go back?
A good question, Bill. And I should note that UNRWA is the major intergovernmental organization that looks after Palestinians, but people who are here in the United States who want to donate should donate to Bill's organization, ANIRA, because they do great work for Palestinians, not actually in Syria, I believe, but Palestinian refugees from Syria coming to Lebanon and elsewhere. So it's kind of a symbol of how desperate the situation of the Palestinians in Syria is, that they seek refuge in Lebanon, knowing full well how terrible the situation of the existing large body of Palestinians in Lebanon already is. And if you read some of these accounts of Palestinian families doubling up and tripling up and quadrupling up to bring refugees from Syria into their homes and camps, and spread of tent encampments in some places in Lebanon. So obviously the situation of Palestinians in Lebanon traditionally has been a lot harsher because of the ingrained conflict in Lebanon, but also because of laws that forbid Palestinians from practicing a large number of professions there, which makes their socioeconomic situation terrible. And if you go to some of the refugee camps like Shatila camp, what remains of Shatila camp in Beirut, it is worse than Dickensian. So, you know, the idea that people are seeking this as a refuge shows you how terrible things are at home. Whether those Palestinian refugees from Syria will want to go back to Syria, obviously, depends a whole lot on how long the conflict remains unresolved in Syria. And as of now, you know, nobody who's looking at the situation can see a way out of the conflict in Syria. I mean, in this crisis group report, they said, well, you know, there are 3 things the West could do, or the international community as they describe it. Number one, they could come in with much bigger military support and topple the regime, which, you know, at a military level they could, but as we saw in Iraq, toppling the regime is step one, and what happens, you know, in the 10 years afterwards is what really devastates everybody. Or number two, they could dial back on the support for the opposition and swallow very hard and say, well, okay, Assad seems to have won this one. You know, what's the best deal we can get out of Assad? And then the third one is to work with the Russians and all other parties to have the external parties de-escalate. And that's not about to happen either. That involves also engaging with Iran as an outside party. So this is the way in which it has become, you know, a regional, or you could even say a global conflict with a Syrian focus. And I don't see anybody here in Washington, D.C. who is at all eager to dial back on this precondition, the thing that I have identified since August of 2011 as the big sticking point, which is that they say, oh, we have to have negotiations among Syrians for the future of Syria, but as a precondition for those negotiations, Assad has to go. You know, that was Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama back in August of 2011, and that has absolutely guaranteed that the conflict continued from them until now and has escalated continuously. So that's not going to change. I don't see any change here in Washington, which means the conflict is going to continue. And the longer it continues, I mean, those were fairly intact refugee communities in Syria. You know, whether they were in refugee camps or in the old city of Damascus or out, you know, other places outside the camps. All those places that were in my little map. That, you know, so people would have, you know, obviously they have their like antecedent identification attachment to their home village in Palestine, home city in Palestine, whatever. And then, you know, over 60 years, they've developed an identification attachment to where they are in Syria. But, you know, if they're in Lebanon for another 10 years, which is extremely likely, who knows what will happen to those communities and that sense of society that maybe they will develop some attachment to Shatila camp. Hard to believe, but, you know, maybe. What do you think?
I kind of agree with what you've said, but I think it also depends on what kind of solution is in the works when the fighting stops, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop anytime soon, and whether Palestinian issues are part of the negotiations. And this is where not having a state is very problematic. Who is going to talk about Palestinian property being destroyed in the fighting, and who's going to rebuild? Like Syrians, probably the priority will be for Syrians to rebuild and to have some kind of compensation for destruction of their property, and then maybe if something's left, it will be for the Palestinian. But I do agree, the longer this drags on, and if Palestinians are in Lebanon, and Lebanon doesn't kick them out, they'll probably stay there.
Okay, we had a question over here.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the speakers and to the Palestinian Center interns, summer interns who organized this event, the series of talks. Now, my question is addressed to Ms. Tota. Dr. Tota? Dr. Tota.
I went to Wellesley.
Okay. If I may go back in history, referring, of course, to the stateless situation of the Palestinians in Syria and everywhere. Now, historically, if we go back to the original problem, which was the imperialistic illegal creation of Israel, what was the attitude of the Palestinians at that time about considering the creation of a Palestinian state which would include Israel, which was the rightful Palestinian territory? Thank you.
Oh, God. Going back into history, to start off, what we're seeing with the crisis in Syria is the unraveling of Sykes-Picot. And I think this has been mentioned by even Noam Chomsky. He talks about how the current crisis in Syria, what's happening in Iraq for the past 20 years, brings to the forefront that Sykes-Picot was a disaster. Now, if you go back to the history, and this is where I'm a bit sketchy, what happened in the Palestinians, the PLO, before even the PLO, the United Nations, the division of Palestine, there were different scenarios that are being lobbied about, and one of them was to create 2 states, one of them was to create 1 state. The Palestinians never really had a say in their future. It was always decided either by imperialist powers or by the more vocal and more powerful Zionists. So it's very much a hypothetical scenario. Like even now the Palestinians will say, okay, we can do with a 2-state solution, and nobody's taking them seriously. And then they say, fine, we'll be just 1 state. And Israel's not taking that seriously either.
More questions? Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Nihat Khader, and I want to ask if there's any resources or information that either of you knows of about vendettas, political vendettas against the Palestinian refugees, especially in Yarmouk. We heard a lot about it with Jabhat al-Nusra, and then there wasn't really much information again. So if you can address that, or the Syrian regime as well.
I haven't heard anything specific, but I do know, like from the nearly 40 years I've been following the Palestinian issue, that picking on Palestinians is a kind of cheap populist move that leaders are always tempted to make. And we see that now with the military leadership, the new military leadership in Egypt, when they're saying, oh, you know, the pro-Morsi demonstrations are so illegitimate because he's stuffed them with Palestinians and Syrians. And they're even building this case against Morsi based on the fact that when he got out of Mubarak's jail in January, February 2011, he did so with the help of Hamas. And that was somehow illegal. I mean, you know, beating up on the Palestinians, you see it again and again and again. In Egypt, it usually goes under the name of a campaign, El-Masr Awalan. And it's quite clear when they say, you know, or in Jordan, they used to have big notices all over the airport, say, El-Ordun Awalan. Well, it's always clear when they say Jordan first, who they are actually beating up on. It's the Palestinians. So vendettas inside Syria, there is so much horrible stuff going on inside Syria. I'm very, very concerned about all these foreign Takfiri fighters who are coming in, who are not only committing these terrible genocidal atrocities and engaging in genocidal mobilization against everybody who is not, like them, a Takfiri Sunni, and that includes a lot of non-Takfiri Sunnis, but everybody who's not a Sunni, definitely. And they are, you know, engaging in this incitement, not in a clandestine way at all, but they're putting it all up on YouTube. And you see these people who barely speak Arabic engaging in these horrific acts of atrocity that are clearly intended to intimidate and to terrify everybody who doesn't agree with them. So, I mean, I did mention, you know, that some of the Palestinians in Syria are Christians. The majority of them are Sunnis. I would say although, you know, Dr. Tota was talking about the ones who've sought solace in religion, that doesn't necessarily make them into takfiri genocidaires. But there's a large proportion of the Sunnis in Syria who are still very secular amongst the Palestinians and among the Syrians. So, I mean, I'm sure that they are subject to all kinds of hate incitement from this Takfiri branch of the opposition, as well as to the repression of the regime. So, you know, as always, caught in a meat grinder.
I just want to add to that Palestinians are not allowed to remain neutral in the conflict. They have to take sides. Mm-hmm. Of course, the regime expects them to be loyal to the regime because, hey, you know, we offered you hospitality, we made you almost Syrian citizens, but then that puts them into conflict with the rebels in the opposition.
And that was exactly what happened in Yarmouk.
And they're split, and Palestinians are split. Some of them have joined and support the rebels, and some of them remain loyal to the regime.
Do we have time for one more question? Yeah. Anybody have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious about Mr. Michels' move to Qatar. So it's not like it's a neutral ground where he went to. So what are your thoughts around what would possess him to sign another Faustian into another Faust? I mean, and all the consequences that you mentioned for the Palestinians at large, you know. So, I mean, it's not like it's always external forces imposing and creating pain for the Palestinian population, but some of the activities, I mean, we saw the same thing in Lebanon, and the Palestinians were a big part of the Lebanon political and military fights and everything. So what was in his benefit by moving to Doha?
I think, first of all, he probably felt he needed to leave Damascus because unacceptable conditions were being placed on him by the regime. And then either subsequent to that decision or at the same time as that decision, he had to find a place to go, and it's not as though there are a lot of places he could have gone. I mean, really, it was probably Tripoli, Libya, or Doha, Qatar. I mean, that was probably the choice he had. You know, I mean, Hamas has had a long, fairly cordial relationship with Turkey, but Turkey as a member of NATO is not about to, invite Hamas to come and set up its leadership there. Maybe he could have gone to Iran, but that would have been really problematic. So, and, Doha does have very nice money, yes. I know it's been quite controversial in Hamas ranks, and most recently there's discussion of Mahmoud Zohar, who's in essence the brain of Hamas in Gaza, looking to restore Hamas's relationship with Iran, because of course that was when Michels moved to Doha, that really caused a big conflict with Iran. And it's all bound up with this regional politics where you used to have this thing called the Jabhat al-Mumana'a, which was Iran and Syria and Hamas and Hezbollah, and now they've made this split between Hamas and Syria. Another aspect of this that some people write about is that the Syrians, well, not the Syrians, but that Hezbollah is really mad at Hamas because, Hezbollah had trained Hamas in a lot of the military stuff from that time in December of 1992 when Yitzhak Rabin expelled 400 Hamas people from the West Bank and Gaza, and they ended up in South Lebanon, and they went to what I have described as Hezbollah University, thanks to Yitzhak Rabin. And they learned from Hezbollah how to do a lot of military things and went back to the West Bank and Gaza and did them. and established a very close military relationship with Hezbollah. And so then when Hamas broke with Syria and in essence sided with the Syrian opposition, they took with them a lot of that expertise to use against the Syrian government and its allies of Hezbollah, which is very problematic. So, that's just one kind of way in which this whole thing in Syria has become a regionalized conflict. And it looks as though it's going to continue to be pushed in that direction more and more.
Anything to add, Dr. Tota?
No, I think that's pretty much.
Okay, well, in that case,
Hot spitter.
Yeah, I want to thank you guys so much again, Ms. Helena Caban and Dr. Faida Tota. And there are some books for sale over here. We also have some kefiyas and some olive oil for sale up front. And we invite you guys to